Today's conversation is brought to you by the Ethiopian Evangelical Churches Fellowship in North America. The Journey to Jubilee event, which will be held in Washington, D.C., July 26th through 27th, will bring together about 15,000 Ethiopian Christians to celebrate 50 years of faithful ministry of EECFNA. This powerful gathering will include first and second generation diaspora leaders. Your organization can be part of equipping the next generation through sponsorship. Visit eecfna.org to learn more.
Today's conversation is the podcast of the National Association of Evangelicals. I'm your host, Walter Kim, NAE President. In these conversations, we seek to help evangelicals foster thriving communities and navigate complexity with biblical clarity. The foundation of thriving communities is, in fact, strong families. That idea resonates with us, but the data also demonstrates it. Brad Wilcox leads the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, and today he joins us with rich insights into marriage, family, and life, with implications for all our ministries and for society as a whole. Brad, thanks so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to this conversation today.
Great to be with you, Walter.
So you're a professor of sociology. Your research specialty is in the area of marriage and family, so it makes sense that you would author a book, Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. All right, so I get the get married part of it, but you have this subtitle that is such a robust statement. Could you share a little bit more of what prompted you to write this book and to write it in the way that you did?
Sure, Walter. Well, I've been really thinking about marriage and family for a long time. Actually, I was an undergraduate here at UVA when I first began to think about the importance of marriage for kids, because I was raised by a single mom and kind of was thinking about the ways in which marriage connected men to their kids on average as an undergraduate at UVA. But in recent years, as a professor at the University of Virginia, talking to a lot of younger women, primarily in my classes, they've been kind of expressing concern about their ability to find, a guy who's sort of worthy of dating. They're worried about their prospects for marriage, more so than in, a decade or two ago. And as I kind of been hearing them and kind of looking at the trends, been realizing that, kind of in some ways, this is sort of the good news today to talk about, but the good news is actually the share of kids who are being raised in stably married parent families is actually increasing in recent years. But that's because marriage and family life have become more and more selective, which means that fewer and fewer adults are actually finding their way to the altar and fewer adults are having kids. And so the point I'm getting at is that my concern for this book is really less about how marriage matters for kids and more about how marriage matters for adults, and trying to give adults a sense of, or young adults especially, this is why marriage is important, for you. And then once you are married, here are some ideas about how you can forge a strong and stable marriage. So kind of aiming more at the young adult audience and folks who are kind of maybe, been married 5, 10, 15 years of marriage and trying to kind of, maybe strengthen their marriage or, avoid ending up in divorce court. So again, but the big picture here is I'm really focusing more on kind of targeting adults, but also kind of, thinking about the ways in which marriage matters for, the broader society, the broader civilization as well.
Okay, so how does marriage loom so important for society as a whole?
So one of the things that I've been doing in the last 20 years is, literally kind of living and working in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson. His Monticello, is just, about 2 miles to my east. And, he's famous, among other things, for talking about the importance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. And when it comes to sort of, I'd say 3 core, in some ways, values or, aspirations associated with our American civilization. When it comes to life, for instance, we know that one of the top predictors now of deaths of despair, that is deaths related to suicide or drug overdoses or alcohol poisonings, which have been rising dramatically in recent years, is the share of married adults in a particular community. So communities where people are not managing to get married and stay married are just way more susceptible to these deaths of despair. So that's sort of one example of how this is kind of a civilizational issue. Another example is we've seen work from Raj Chetty at Harvard kind of telling us that the top predictor of mobility for poor kids, that is rising from rags to riches across the course of their lives, at the community level is the share of two-parent families in a community. And what that means practically is that a metro area like Salt Lake City has much more mobility for poor kids. They're more likely to rise into prosperity as adults than poor kids who are growing up in the Atlanta metro area, where there are many more single-parent families. And so it kind of just shows us that sort of what's happening in our neighborhoods and our communities in the family matters for poor kids in important ways, and the American dream. So that's a civilizational point. And then the third thing I would just sort of say is we've seen happiness, the pursuit of happiness, to use Jefferson's language, has become more difficult for a growing minority of Americans in recent decades. And there's a recent study coming out of the University of Chicago that tells us that kind of the top factor they found in their research, or this economist, was, again, the declining share of Americans who are married. So my point here, Walter, is just to kind of make the point that what happens, in our personal relationships and in our homes, often, I think for Americans, they think about it as just a deeply personal thing. But as we look at the social science, we see is that this matters. What's happening in our homes and our relationships really matters for the broader civilization. And if we think about this in a more theological way, we can think, both in the Pauline epistles, but also even more in the 20th century, about the way in which the great German Lutheran Dietrich Bonhoeffer kind of talked about in his letters from prison, kind of the way in which marriage was not just about kind of the relationship between two adults, but he talked about it as kind of as an office, and you had kind of a post of responsibility for not just in a sense to your family, but even I think in Bonhoeffer's view for the world. And we can see, I think, in this kind of data that Bonhoeffer was definitely onto something in his reflections on marriage from prison in Germany in World War II.
Brad, you've just given us so much to unpack and ponder. I want to push a little bit with this whole, is correlation the same thing as causation? In other words, we have these things that come together, but we haven't really established that one thing causes another. So, taking the skeptic's hat on now.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
How do we know that this is not just grand coincidences? How do we know that being married actually produces these outcomes that you're describing?
That's a great question. I certainly think we have to acknowledge here that we cannot and we should not randomly assign, right, like adults to married households and single households, and we can't randomly assign kids to being raised by a single mom, as I was, as a child, or by two married parents, right? So we have to sort of, I think, appreciate that there are questions here in terms of correlation and causation that scholars can debate, and obviously I'm more on the side of there's an important causal story to be told here, but I would certainly acknowledge kind of the opposite perspective is, Walter, that a lot of these things are about selection effects, and that is the kinds of people today who are getting married and staying married are more likely to be well-educated, more affluent, but also more religious and now more conservative, and also more Asian American than other Americans are. So, when you look at some of these findings, you can wonder, I think, is this a story about marriage, or is this a story about education or affluence or religion or even ethnicity, right? At the same time, in the multivariate work that we do at the Institute for Family Studies and at UVA, I am controlling for other factors like ethnicity and race and education and affluence, and still finding, an association net of those things. But there could be something else, in the mix. But we are also seeing with, both econometric studies and with psychological studies, some new innovations in methods that are, I think, noteworthy. So for instance, when it comes to psychology, we have twin studies now, Walter. And so we can compare, for instance, identical male twins. There's a big study from Minnesota of identical male twins. And what we find is that the male twins who are married are more likely to be working and earning more money than their identical male twin brothers who are not married. So it's I think, more compelling evidence maybe for people who are skeptical that there's something about marriage per se that I think helps us men, for instance, to be often more prudential in how we approach work and more diligent oftentimes as well. When it comes to kind of the effects of family structure on children, there's work by Jonathan Gruber, an economist at MIT, not a conservative. And what he did is looked at states in the 1970s and compared kids from states where there was no-fault divorce that had been passed, kind of a weaker marital regime, if you will, from kids in the, he compared kids who were in no-fault divorce states and kids in fault-based, regimes. So basically what he found was that kids who were in the more restrictive divorce regime did better into adulthood compared to kids who were born in states with a kind of a more permissive divorce legal regime. And his point was trying to figure out, is there something about the institution of marriage per se, and family stability per se, that is causally related to kids' outcomes? So these kind of clever econometric designs, I think, are also maybe more compelling than just sort of telling you that there's a very strong association in the data between, stable married families and better outcomes for adults and kids.
That's one, that's just really interesting. And two, it's very heartening because certainly from a theological point of view, there's a very strong commitment to believe and affirm that marriage would be foundational to society. I mean, the very metaphors that God instituted in scriptures are familial, the relationship between Christ and the church, or the fact that Christians are to call each other brothers and sisters in Christ. I mean, there's this deep, deep familial structure to what the church would represent or Christian life would represent. And that would presumably be built off the fact that God designed the family to be so foundational. So, I mean, it's heartening both because it's interesting what you're describing, but it's heartening also because there is this growing match now between what Scripture has long affirmed with, hey, data might, in fact, be saying this is true. And it becomes an entry point to talk more broadly in society that may not have the theological reasons, but they certainly have a case that they could heed for, hey, we have some problems in our society, and maybe we need to look at the way that family, marriage in particular, can contribute. I'm curious to hear a little bit about like your own matching of that theological description of what I'm describing from my end of the work to just your interests as a researcher.
Yeah, so I'm Catholic, and I'm kind of shaped, in that sense by the natural law tradition. And I would sort of expect to find kind of correlation, use that term again, that's pretty strong between a lot of our teachings about marriage and family with the empirical research. But it's not a perfect correlation, obviously. And what I try to do as a sociologist is to, in part, is to kind of look at data often with colleagues and crunch numbers and try to figure out what's happening. And so generally find that a lot of what I think we would expect to find as Christians, is actually represented in the data. But there are also exceptions. So I did a project a while back, for instance, looking at the presence of fathers in kids' homes vis-a-vis educational outcomes. And certainly in the United States and in other parts of the world, like East Asia, for instance, when you kind of look at that story, you find that there is a strong association between kind of intact families, dad's present, biological dad's present, and kids doing better in school. But in this work, in other parts of the world, I didn't find as any empirical association between a father being present and kids doing better on some important schooling outcomes. And as I kind of looked more carefully at these particular societies, what I found was that there wasn't a strong norm there of dads being engaged with their kids, schooling, whether it's like helping them with homework or even paying for their schooling, right? So, that kind of helped me to make sense of it. So just my point is that in general, a lot of research that I do find there's a kind of, interesting, powerful, encouraging correlation between, many of our theological convictions about family life and marriage, but also we'll find, depending upon the country and the context, cases where it's not, the results are not as I expect. So that's kind of an important caveat.
Well, I want to circle back to, and I appreciate that level of honesty, because you really are trying to assess the data as you see it and ask good probing questions and be open to where data leads you. Coming back to the things that you talked about in terms of loneliness, addiction, deaths of despair. And there's a whole range. I mean, there's the actual death, suicide rates, but then there's just the experience of loneliness, disconnectedness that seems so prevalent right now in our society. Talk a little bit more about the impacts of marriage on those issues. And I'm going to have a follow-up question of, so should people just go ahead and get married? And what about bad marriages and loneliness or deaths of despair? So let's just start with draw out a little bit more of the impacts of marriage on this spectrum of loneliness, mental health, deaths of despair.
So again, we have research from scholars like Jonathan Rothwell, who did a piece for us on these deaths of despair at the regional level and shares of Americans who are married, and finding a very strong association, even net of controlling for factors like education, poverty, and race. I'm looking here at kind of a figure, just kind of charting out in one survey we did in 2021 with YouGov on the percentage of Americans who say their life is lonely most or all of the time. And what we found is that for married adults aged 18 to 55, only 14% said that they were lonely most or all the time, compared to 25% for single parents and 29% for single and childless adults. So the point here is that, well, number one, most Americans are not that lonely in this particular survey, which is encouraging, but there's clearly a greater risk for loneliness for single adults or unmarried adults compared to married adults. And so I would say that on average, married Americans are markedly less likely to be lonely, also less likely to succumb to, suicide and other forms of, substance abuse that can lead to death as well. So that's kind of, that's the big picture. But obviously we have to acknowledge that if you're in a difficult marriage, or if one spouse is kind of checking out of the marriage, or both, perhaps, that can be a profoundly lonely place. So I'm not saying that every married person obviously is going to be protected from loneliness. We know, as a pastor, that's not the case. But it's just that on average, Americans who are getting married and staying married are more likely to be, flourishing a number of fronts and less likely to be lonely. So at the same time, I would say, what is it about? What are some of the factors that go into a higher quality marriage, which is in a sense most protective against loneliness, but also most likely to, lead to genuine human flourishing? And so my book obviously talks about the importance of cultivating a sense of communion, a we before me, mentality in marriage. And I talk about that practically in terms of things like regular date nights seem to be incredibly important for fostering that sense of communion. For example, I talk about the importance, obviously, of commitment, kind of having the sense that your spouse puts your welfare first in some important ways, at least in sort of this world, but also kind of I talk in my book about kind of fidelity, kind of embracing the norm of sexual fidelity, which means it's going to, having a certain kind of prudential approach to relationships with other people outside your marriage, to kind of protect your marriage. I talk about that in the book. Talk about the importance of kind of embracing a norm of marital permanence as a source of not just an ethical commitment, but also as a way of kind of giving your marriage a greater sense of trust and security as well. And then I talk at the end of the book about kind of the importance of community and focus especially on religious communities and the ways in which, on average, Americans who are church-going as a couple, obviously, especially, are more likely to be flourishing in marriages and, more likely to have, report greater happiness, less divorce, more sexual satisfaction. And I also find in previous work too that prayer, as a couple, is a strong predictor of marital satisfaction as well. So these are just some ways of thinking about how church-going couples can in a sense maximize their odds of forging a strong and stable marriage that most of the time will be a source of sustenance and encouragement, and satisfaction for them.
I can imagine the trajectory of what you're describing, how that would affirm that. So like as individuals, we're better off than in this marriage context because we're sharing life together, we're navigating the complexities, it has all these positive outcomes. And the trajectory of what you're describing is, moving from the me-centered to the we-centered, even within the family, to actually being a part of broader community could only strengthen that. Is that right, what I'm describing, that there's like this communal benefit that accrues as we're expanding and enriching the networks in which we navigate life?
Yeah, I mean, the point, the phrase that I use in the book is, from Aristotle, that says we're social animals. And so my argument in the book, right, is that a lot of Americans today tend to think that, education, building their own brand, and especially their work will be kind of the key pathway for them when it comes to forging a meaningful and a happy life. And I say, by contrast, actually, when you kind of, both in my data, but also there's a study out of Harvard tracking adults over many, many years into their 80s, what my research with that Harvard study finds is actually, it's our relationships with friends and family, and particularly oftentimes with a spouse, that end up being kind of the number one predictor of things like meaning and happiness. And yet the other piece there, right, is that when it comes to marriage, I think being surrounded by other couples and by a community, and single friends as well, who are with you and for you in the journey of life, is also an incredibly important part of forging a good marriage too.
I want to come back to the subtitle because what you're describing is this really a positive portrait of the gains, the benefits, religious terminology, the blessing of marriage. But your subtitle includes why Americans must defy the elites.
Right.
What are you responding to? Are there myths about marriage? Are there myths about life that you're really counteracting? You just named one of like, get a good career, self-promotion, that's going to lead to happiness. And that seems to be one myth you're addressing. But what are you pushing against?
Yeah, so when the title first came out, one of the more prominent center-left journalists, Matt Iglesias, pushed back on Twitter and said, basically, what are you talking about, Brad? I mean, we know that elites in America are more likely to forge strong and stable marriages. So why should we be encouraging Americans to defy the elites? And of course, he hadn't seen the book because it wasn't released at that point. He just saw the title. But I do talk about in the book the ways in which elites often kind of talk left in public about marriage and family, but kind of walk right in private. By that, I mean they kind of tend to embrace marriage and an intensive kind of parenting in their own private lives, but often tend to discount the importance of marriage or even kind of attack marriage as an institution in their public roles as journalists, school superintendents, professors, even C-suite executives now. And the irony there is actually Matt Iglesias had written a piece for Vox, a prominent progressive platform, a number of years ago, kind of saying that sort of the decline of marriage is no problem. And here's a guy who himself was married, seems happily married, they've got a son, all this kind of stuff. So he was kind of unwittingly kind of a great example of this whole phenomenon. But when it comes to kind of what elites are doing that I think is unhelpful, is things like propagating what I call the family diversity myth, which is kind of this idea that every family structure is equally valid or valuable for kids. And that what really matters for kids is not marriage, for their parents, but actually money and love, kind of defined in a very kind of vague way. I talked to you about the sort of flying solo myth, this idea that, people can be just as happy on average as single persons as they can in a married context, which again, on average is not true. But I also talked to you in the book about the ways in which when it comes to some core commitments, like commitment, for instance, or community, our elites are often kind of giving, bad messaging. So one example of this now, I think, could be in terms of this issue of commitment. And what we're seeing now in recent months even is a lot of different media outlets promoting polyamory, kind of discounting the importance of monogamy and sexual fidelity as we would classically understand them. And yet, when you look at the data, as I do in my book, what I find is that Americans who embrace the kind of classic, fidelity norm of, steering clear of, alternatives are markedly happier in their marriages than, unfortunately, a growing number of Americans who don't embrace, the classic norm of kind of forswearing others, in marriage. So it's kind of one example of how our elites are often pushing some kind of new practice, new relationship strategy, that's kind of come down the pike and kind of giving it their baptism, and yet when we look at kind of how people are living their real lives, people who are abiding by that classic understanding of fidelity are more likely to be flourishing. And then another example is more direct for, I think, your audience. There was a big interview in the New Yorker between Isaac Chotiner, one of their journalists, and the sociologist Sam Perry. And Perry was kind of attacking Christian men for being guilty about, using pornography. He was saying that their wives, quote, draw a hard line, unquote, against their husband's pornography use and are, quote, twice as likely to divorce their husbands because of pornography use. And just kind of painting a very negative portrait about the way in which a kind of more traditional understanding and view of sex had made pornography a much more vexing issue for Christian couples than for other American couples. Now, what Perry and what the New Yorker, in a sense, left out here was that, yes, for people who are religious, I think pornography is a more vexing issue, when it becomes, a personal problem in their marriages. But in general, what my data indicates is that, for the average church-going couple, the average evangelical, they're happier than the average secular American. They have a lower divorce rate than the average, American secular couple. They have sex actually markedly more often now, this is new actually, than the average secular couple. And they're markedly more sexually satisfied on average than the average couple. So Perry was leaving out kind of the whole picture. It's just focusing on the subset of evangelicals who were struggling with this issue of pornography, but neglecting to kind of tell us the bigger, the bigger story. And in so doing, I think, was kind of feeding this New Yorker audience a pretty negative message about the links between faith and family. So it's in this sense that I think we need to defy our elites who are often skeptical about the value of faith, skeptical about, many of our norms and customs and values that when you actually look at them, are incredibly powerfully associated with, on average, both more stable and happier marriages.
I'm going to ask a question that's more on a personal level, at least personal for me. You mentioned four groups: Asian Americans, conservative, religious, college educated, and I happen to tick all four boxes.
Right, you should be doing incredibly well.
But the Asian American part,
right.
This is interesting to me. I could imagine the culture, the religious part, the education part. Talk a little bit more about how ethnicity, whether it's Asian American or whatever ethnicity,
Sure,
how
sure.
ethnicity and ethnic norms are playing into this, because our country is becoming a lot more diverse. And this is a data point that I think is really fascinating, has big implications with the cultural mosaic that is now much more normative of who we are as Americans.
Yeah, so one point to make on your question is just that immigrants in general tend to be more likely to be married in the first place and stably married in the second place compared to native-born Americans.
Hmm.
And then I say this actually with a note of lament, right? I mean, I'm an American. I was born here in the United States, and I think it's unfortunate that we're now living in a cultural context where the ambient ethos in this society today is not as conducive, to forging a good marriage as the ambient ethos is in other, cultural contexts around the globe. So that's one point to make. But then when you look at ethnic groups, you find that Asian Americans, and especially immigrants from Asia, have the most stable marriages and are generally the most likely to be married Americans today. And there's no group of Americans who have higher level of marriage and more marital stability than immigrants from India. And I think if we're speaking kind of in general terms about, and obviously there are huge distinctions between, say, South Koreans and Vietnamese Americans and Indian Americans, but generally there's often a somewhat more collectivist ethos in many of these, cultural contexts. In some contexts, they're Confucian, some Hindu, some Muslim, but a lot of the kind of underlying values tend to be pretty marriage centered and pretty kind of oriented towards what we call in sociology familism rather than individualism. So you have this idea that what matters is, being a good husband, being a good wife, being a good father, mother, son, and daughter, oftentimes more than just kind of doing what I want to do, which is kind of more the oftentimes the default American approach that what we call expressive individualism in the United States. So I think the fact that there's this collectivist or familistic ethos is part of the story. But one more thing I would mention is that when you talk to particularly immigrants from Asia, whether they're Indian or Korean or whatever, is they often kind of connect in very explicit ways the stability of their marriage and family towards the success of their children. Hmm. So I talked to an Indian American parent, for instance, for the book, and he was just kind of mentioning how he sees his home life is so connected to his kids' ability to do well in school and then do well in life later on. Hmm. And the same view was expressed by a Korean American woman too that I spoke with for the book. So there's a way in which kind of there's an explicit connection in their own minds and hearts between what happens in the home and their kids' ability to realize the American dream, both in terms of education and professional and financial success. And I would say that they're right. I mean, they understand and appreciate that strong families make for kids who are more likely to be flourishing. Now, I think we could have, certainly, have a discussion about whether or not like education, professional success, and financial success, right, are the be all and end all for our kids. But there's no question that generally speaking, kids who are raised in stably married families, do better on those kinds of outcomes.
This is an interesting, conversation with respect to not only my work and religious communities, and distinctly evangelical Christian communities, work as a pastor. It's very heartening in those regards. But you have this save civilization part. How are we going to do that if there are these conflicting narratives about the efficacy of marriage, the importance of it, and what is the call to action in all of this?
Right. So I've already kind of, underlined my view that I think on some really important outcomes, whether it's the American dream or the pursuit of happiness, or even just kind of like, on the life issue in a variety of ways. marriage is incredibly important. It's also one of the best, not surprisingly, predictors of fertility. And of course, we haven't talked about this, but fertility has come way down in the United States. We're now below replacement. It's happening across the globe too. So I think in terms of how do we kind of turn a corner here? Well, I think that there are a couple of things that need to happen to turn a corner here. One is that we need to kind of understand that when it comes to our, our homes, that we as parents need to do a better job of educating our kids about kind of, and also, of course, modeling as for those of us who are married, good marriages to our children, to kind of give them a template, to aspire to, embrace when they're older. So I think thinking about what kind of messages we're communicating in our homes, unfortunately, even when it comes to like UVA students who have evangelical parents, I often hear from them that mom and dad have basically told them they've got to wait until they're like 28, 29, 30, where they've got all their ducks in a row in terms of, schooling and a great career start before they can begin to think about marriage and family. And from my perspective, that's, not great advice, because I think oftentimes, young adults have no better place to meet people than in their collegiate setting. And so if you meet a great, boyfriend or girlfriend in college, I think, there's no reason you should think you have to wait until you're 28 or 29, to put a ring on it, right? So I think as parents, we can do a better job of kind of communicating to our kids that, for most of us, the kind of vocation to marriage and family is the most important thing we'll do. And so we should prepare for it and value it. I think in our schools, again, we need to do, including Christian schools, just do a much better job of kind of teaching about the importance in terms of the values and virtues that are associated with marriage, but also kind of theology of marriage as well, just to kind of, and family, integrate that more tightly into the fabric of our schools. Public schools, obviously, even more so. When it comes to, same thing for universities, I think we should have courses that help young adults, acquire the skills, the virtues that would make them better spouses and better friends as well. Handling things like conflict more constructively as friends and as couples. And then when it comes to obviously the pop culture and social media, there's a real need to kind of tell a better story about marriage and family. So just one example right now is that most young women think that marriage and motherhood lead to less happiness. Unfortunately, when we look at the polling data now, Walter. And yet when we look at the actual data in terms of who's happiest in America today, especially in midlife, looking even just at women, no question that women who are married with kids are almost twice as likely to be very happy with their lives compared to single and childless women, in midlife. So we need to, in media, social media, and other kind of, Hollywood and whatnot, do a better job of telling the true story, which is that, yeah, family, marriage can be super tough. And there can be a cross, to use more theological language, at the heart of a marriage, the heart of a family relationship, but that on average, people are more likely to flourish. So that's, I think, the challenge facing us. But the encouragement that I would say is that, number one, church-going Americans are doing better at all of this than secular Americans, and they should know that and understand that things like prayer and community are super helpful for couples and families. And then secondly, I think history often moves not in a linear direction, but I think kind of in a pendulum, going from one pendulum to the other, right? And so we've seen, for instance, when it comes to the growing secularization of American life, there's been a larger and larger share of young adults who are saying they have no religious affiliation, the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S's, not M-U-N-S's. And the nuns, though, it looks like have bottomed out or topped off, if you will. We have new data showing us that Gen Zers are more likely to identify with religious tradition than millennials. And so this, just kind of seeing this data recently reminded me that I'm hoping for that day we're going to see sort of the same thing when it comes to marriage, that kind of the share of Americans who are married in their 20s or their 30s has been like, coming down relentlessly since the 1970s. But I think, my suspicion, my hope, obviously, is that at some point it levels off and then we begin to see an upturn as people understand and appreciate that this is an incredibly important social institution, and that both personally and collectively we can do more to strengthen it.
Wow, that is very encouraging. Any final word that you would wish to share with us?
I think the only thing that I would say is that, again, we're living in a culture. I actually got this idea from my wife, so this is appropriate talking about marriage. But I was sort of asking her, like, what kind of, myth would you conjure up to talk about the way in which we've kind of gotten off, course here in this culture? And so my wife said, "What about the myth of King Midas?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's a great." That's a great myth. So, I've talked about this in some public addresses, but the point obviously is that here you've got a guy who's kind of focusing on gold. You could think, you put in like, education, work, financial success, building your own brand, in today's way of thinking, this Midas mindset, rather than kind of prioritizing, marriage and family and friends and faith. So I think the challenge for us, especially younger adults who are, often, told by their parents, their professors, their peers in pop culture to kind of prioritize, education, building your own brand and your job above everything else, uber alles, to recognize that at the end of our days, and even in your 20s, oftentimes, looking for love and making an effort to, date, mate, and marry, and then have a family is, again, for most of us, the path that we should be more intentional about pursuing. Would be kind of my final comment.
Our guest on today's conversation has been Brad Wilcox. I'm Walter Kim, and on behalf of us all, thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Walter.